Welcome to Mind, Crime, Liberty Show with me, Swithin Dobson, and him, Tim Batten. Today we have our second episode on coronavirus, which we'll also discuss why Nassim Taleb is wrong. So, what's happened since our original coronavirus episode? Well, to put it mildly, we were right. The predictions about mass deaths, overused hospitals and people out on the streets because they can't get hospital beds simply hasn't taken place. The need for massive amounts of ventilators to flatten the curve was simply seemingly not needed. There have been other ways of treating it, and there's been reports that ventilators in many cases are actually a bad intervention for coronavirus patients. So all the apocalypse that was predicted simply hasn't happened. We've had vastly empty hospitals to a large extent because they've stopped all other treatments, expecting this great wave of people, and it just hasn't happened. They even built temporary field hospitals, which had barely any patients, if any, in England. So where we are now is we're basically down to very few cases. I mean, in England, they're complaining about a spike in cases, which I think they are in the US. But the thing is, these cases aren't medical cases. They aren't ill. They're just testing positive because 90% of people who have it simply have no symptoms whatsoever. So we're seemingly in a position now where certain people, or maybe in the media or whatever, want to try and make it look like, oh no, we haven't flattened the curve, we haven't sorted it all out. Actually, there's more cases coming. But again, they're just numerical cases. They're just, are you tested positive for coronavirus? You're not necessarily ill. So really, where we are today is in Western Europe, or in England, we have very, very few coronavirus recorded deaths. I think the last one for the last day was like 8 people. There are more cases, but again, the cases aren't medical cases. And so really, in any meaningful sense, the pandemic is over. However, there was a specter of the second wave. They might even push it out to a third wave. Whether that will happen and depends on various factors, mutation of the virus, etc. I don't know. But that's pretty much a very succinct summary of where we are, at least in the medical sense today. Tim, any thoughts on this?
I agree. I think the Mindcrimeliberty show was right from the start. This was actually one of the reasons why we started the show, or similar views on the coronavirus. And it's the state action as well as the social action. One of the points I think need to be made to start here, and one of the reasons why I'm opposed to it, the policy in general, regardless of whether it works, is I think the policy is utopian. I think the measures the state has done or wanted people to do were utopian. And what's really frustrating me through the whole thing is Nassim Taleb. I've learned a lot from Nassim Taleb. I think there's arguments within Nassim Taleb's earlier work to suggest that he should actually have our position, not this lunacy position. Now, to be fair, Taleb is a bit more nuanced than many lockdown advocates. For one thing, he's been more consistent since the start, and for the second thing, he called out. He actually might have been the person whose paper someone in the Trump administration was a Taleb fan, supposedly, and that's why they closed the border with China. Supposedly, whether or not this is true. So he did have some influence. Of course, all the Democrats thought this was, fascism because they closed the border with China. And they did it with Europe, too, earlier. And again, same thing. But nonetheless, that's been one of my frustrations. But back to the view is that I think these policies are enacted throughout the lockdown, and even the milder lockdown in the United States, has been utopian. And the second point I think I have to make before I get to the continue on the utopian is the null hypothesis. And this has been running through my head the whole time. Because it's been recently reported that Sweden has probably ends up with about the same number of total per deaths. Maybe fewer, maybe more. But again, if the fact that they could get the outcome of fewer is evidence enough to suggest that there's the null hypothesis true, that there's no relationship between government action and number of coronavirus deaths. So regardless if the measures worked or not, and we can come up with the conclusion that none of these policies seem to have much effect at all. If we end up with the same rough estimates. Now again, the problem with any of these sort of empirical analysis is there's so many differences between countries, there's so many differences between medical systems, ages of population, and all sorts of things, that maybe it's impossible to compare. But again, I think the fact that we can come up with the wrong answer, like if you test the minimum wage and you get the wrong answer, either way for either side, if you're taking the pro or the anti side, you can get the quote-unquote wrong answer. So I think that remains as an extremely interesting point. But I'm going to go back to the tragic. Thomas Sowell has this idea of tragic vision, or the restrained vision, and Steven Pinker will call this the tragic vision. It's just the idea that man has a limited control over his environment. The unrestrained or unlimited vision is the idea that we can control things. There's a few pictures I've been thinking about to look at the background for this podcast, and there's three of them. There's a picture of the Chicxulub crater, I might be pronouncing that. It's out in the Yucatan Peninsula, Mexico. According to mainstream people, it's probably what killed the dinosaur. It's about 250 miles. It's humongous. Whoever was in power, Stalin, Hitler, the Pope, we kept the Roman Catholic Church. If we got the Protestant fundamentalist church, if we put the Buddhists in charge, whoever was in charge, I just see no reason to suggest we can control a meteor or a comet coming at the Earth that large. Right? I mean, the sun is basically a nuclear bomb that interrupts with huge sunspots. So there's certain things that are out of the realm of our control. One of them is that. And that would kill us all, regardless of what political party is in charge. The other two things is the duck and cover drills. The duck and cover drills are interesting to me, and I think this is what the coronavirus lockdown policy ends up being. Before we get into the statistics again, I'd like Swithin to comment on this. The duck and cover drills, and the government basically admitted later that they probably wouldn't have done anything. There's a very small amount of people that duck and cover drills would have saved. You couldn't be too far away from if you were too close to the blast radius, everyone would just get radiated or incinerated, basically. If you're too far away, the windows wouldn't have broken anyway. You just get exposed to the radiation sickness, that just goes through everything, including the desk. So I think there's a real similarity between the duck and cover drill and the coronavirus hysteria, because maybe I'm something fatalist here, but I just don't really see much ability to control viruses using borders, police, pieces of cloth, and things like that. I'm not skeptical of vaccines, although depending on the death rate, you have to factor in the opportunity cost. Like if it's not that deadly of disease, then taking a vaccine, more medicine is not always a good thing. So even there, vaccines work. Like polio isn't actually a deadly disease, tuberculosis, those things. So there's that. So vaccines, I'm not a skeptic of vaccines, but I'm a skeptic of these sort of people who stand 6 feet apart, and all these other actions, and closing the borders too, and shutting down travel. So Swithin, do you agree with my view that it's like a sort of silly duck and cover drill? My personal view is a lot of this stuff is out of control, out of man's control. And even if it's in our control, the idea that we can all just stay inside all day indefinitely for 18 months is utopian. The economy would fall apart. I'm not just talking about the entertainment economy. I'm talking about the literal production of food. People need to be out farmers need to be driving tractors in the field. The number of essential workers to maintain the society is just too large. That's enough people to spread it. And one of the things that Taleb makes about the past, which is a disanalogy, is, and this is, I think, one of the interesting points to bring up statue burners, is Columbus is to a certain extent a super spreader. The border between the Atlantic and the Eurasia, what Taleb calls Eurasia, and the border between the Americas was a very solid border. It was the Atlantic Ocean. No one, again, maybe a few people could once in a while get across by chance. But in general, there wasn't any trade between the Eurasian Americas. Once Columbus and Cortez showed up, 90% of them were dead within 100 years. So again, you can control viruses if you have something like 2 separate planets. But you can't control virus. I mean, you can't. They're just out of our control. So Swithin, any comments so far?
Yes. Firstly, when you look at sort of lockdown policies, all the countries have the same distribution of daily death rates. Now, they might peak at different levels, but they're broadly the same. Now, does this imply that any lockdown policies per se don't work? Well, we can't really say that necessarily, but they certainly don't seem to make as big a difference as you think they might do. Now, why this is the case and how the viruses actually transmit is interesting. It's difficult to say. But it bears out what Lutowski said, who's a retired epidemiologist who YouTube kept taking off because of his heretical views. Said it's a coronavirus. They always play out the same way. There's lots in the first 3 or 4 weeks. Keep all the vulnerable people away from everybody and let it play out, because that's what they always do, which it did. So he was sort of proven right there. And this is, I think, the problem with Taleb, actually, and also all the mathematical modelers, is they're treating everything mathematically. Taleb, interestingly, is taking a quite a prioristic view of things here. It's like, well, we've got all these super spreaders together. What's going to happen is we're going to have these exponential cases, because that was basically the claim. We were going to overwhelm hospitals. So we're getting this exponential rise in cases, and yes, you do to some extent, but it's not forever. It's far from that. It actually dissipates reasonably quickly thereafter. So that lockdown policies don't seem to have made a huge amount of difference to the overall death rate. And yes, it also seems to show that you're not able to actually stop these diseases going through certain people in the population. And you point out, Taleb's preferred solution is basically quarantines of various descriptions. Although, interestingly, when I read a transcript of his discussion with Russ Roberts at Econ Talk, he was actually advocating relatively mild ones, and like, oh, we're only going to stop suspected cases and people we might think are ill. But like the whole point, I thought, with coronavirus was that you didn't know if you were ill and you could be asymptomatic for 2 weeks. So I'm not sure how he squares that. But as you point out, large-scale quarantines are just completely impractical in a world economy. You have people crossing borders all the time. You have goods and services crossing borders all the time. And you simply can't do it. You could do it in, say, the Black Death. I think Milan did this. Milan basically cut itself off from the rest of Europe, and therefore far fewer people died of the Black Death. But you simply can't do it. Well, sorry. You can do it. It is possible to do it. The question is whether you want to or not. To really stop it, what we would need to do is to have sort of nation states with perfect protectionism, and then you would, or forever quarantines, just in case one disease from one country went to another. I mean, that's what you would have to do. I mean, that's a world that is conceivable. The question is whether you'd want to live in it or not. But back to Taleb. Taleb gets things fundamentally wrong. If you read his ideas when it comes to pandemics, all stem from his paper he wrote on genetically modified organisms. And his claim basically is, his original claim, which makes sense, is, well, we don't care about averages. No one really cares about averages. What you care about is extremes. So he gives a good example of this, saying, no one wants to know what the average height of a lake is if you're going to walk through it. What you want to know is what's the deepest length, because the deepest bit could kill you. And so, if you're gambling or whatever, you always want to make sure you have money to gamble again, because if you lose everything, well then you can't gamble again. And so what he makes a distinction between risk and ruin risk, and you don't want to risk ruin because that means you're out of the game. And in a sense, in an individual basis, ruin risk is death. But then he scales it up analogously and says, pandemics, if you run them on these infinity-based mathematical models, eventually we'll get a pandemic which, in principle could kill everybody and destroy life as we know it. Well, life entirely in human terms. And consequently, we must do as much as we can to stop that from happening. Although he doesn't seem to say that there's likely to be one that's going to kill absolutely everybody. And to really completely destroy society, you'd need to kill everybody such that there was no fertile female or virile male left. Because if you had them, then society would still continue, and there wouldn't be ruin of society. So he disanalogously goes from individual ruin risk to societal ruin risk, but then kind of allows a substantial destruction to society being analogous to individual death, which simply isn't the case. So he has, on a theoretical level, I think, a big problem that his whole approach is based on. And that's why he's going on the precaution, on this sort of, he says, the non-naive precautionary principle. But with his discussion with Ioannidis, indirectly, the one interesting thing with Taleb is he says, once we know that a certain number of people have died from a new disease, then we have to treat it as if it could kill everybody. But that assumes that we know who they died from it, rather than just with it, which isn't immediately obvious, especially in respect of coronavirus. But then he says we know this, and then he's highly skeptical of current infection fatality rates, etc. Well, I mean, be fair enough. You could be skeptical of those to some extent, but I mean, the confidence interval is somewhere between 0.1 and 0.7%. And I mean, that's not at any rate that's going to just have a ruin risk for the entire world. So he seems to have a very odd and schizophrenic attitude towards what we actually do know at present, and so I suppose what you could have said, his position may be reasonable in the first month or so, but we know a lot more now than we did then. And to treat it as if, we don't know anything, but at the same time saying, we know that some young people have got bad long-term respiratory damage from it. It's like, well, Nassim, how do you know that's because of coronavirus? Could it have been from something else? So he seems to have a really schizophrenic attitude towards what we actually know and what we don't know. And then he makes a somewhat folksy argument for masks. So, we know masks stop phlegm and stuff going on to people, so therefore it will stop disease. Which is like, well, not necessarily. But again, he goes into disanalogies again. He says, we don't need a scientific study that says parachutes stop people dying when you're jumping out of a plane. Well, it's like, well, yes, I agree with him, you don't need all this quote-unquote evidence-based medicine. But it simply doesn't apply in the case of masks. I read reports that some surgeons stopped wearing them like 10, 20 years ago after some randomized control trials and said they didn't actually work and probably made things worse. And in actuality, the surgeons wear masks to stop getting infected from the patient. So Taleb goes in for huge disanalogies and is hugely schizophrenic with what we actually do know at present. And so despite him having some good stuff, and I do like some of his work, he is very, very wrong when it comes to his non-naive precautionary principle.
I agree. He's been extremely schizophrenic about this. But I sort of started predicting that he would go this way once the GMO paper came out, which I was skeptical about was on the offense about. Again, I don't work for Monsanto either, but I was skeptical to a certain extent because, and this is one of the problems I have, is you have to. There are certain risks which are A, unavoidable, and B, you have to take. He has the example, well, if there's water on the floor, do you drink it? Do you need evidence? Well, what if you haven't drank anything for the last week? I might drink that. I was out on a trip once, and I was getting thirsty, and there was a public restroom, and I filled up my water bottle at a public restroom bathroom in the middle of a state park. Could the water have been poisoned? I don't know. I didn't want to get dehydrated or have to call a helicopter, which would have been a huge boo-ha about. So there are certain situations you're put in where you just sort of have to take the risk. And there's certain risks that are just unavoidable, and there's nothing we can really do about. Meteors, asteroids, the sun blowing up, and so forth. Again, one of my problems with alarmisms in general is they're not alarmist enough, if anything. And the solutions they adopt tend to be like Band-Aid solutions. And one of the things I fear about this coronavirus stuff is this is the blueprint for the climate change thing. And interestingly enough, Glenn Loury, a black conservative, runs a great YouTube channel, who's interviewed the late Michael Brooks. And one of the Glenn Loury's criticisms of this is that, if climate change is as bad as you say it is, what can we really do about it? We've already put in, and this is Bob Murphy points this out too, we've already put in huge amounts of carbon. Isn't it if we just stop burning carbon, it will just happen anyway, the greenhouse effect? So this works two ways. This is sort of intersectional right-wing like skepticism here, because if the virus is really deadly, we're basically screwed in that sense. We're fortunate that it's not deadly. I don't think standing 6 feet apart would have stopped it if it was had the death rate of 50%. Now maybe again you could do the Malaysian example but no one wants to do that. And today, thanks to modern technology, that's just impossible. We didn't have Boeing 787 Dreamliners. Even groups like the Senghalese, when they generally get contacted, most of them end up dying. There was an example in the 1950s where a group of Russians, a family of Russians, got sidetracked from Siberia, somewhere up in Siberia. It's a funny example. And they just basically lived off the land. All they read was the Bible. They were a group of old believers. They were like the Amish on steroids. The Russians found them someday because they saw a fence in the middle of nowhere, 700 miles from anywhere. And half the son and the father and the daughter, I think, ended up dying of disease afterwards. So yeah, you can avoid these things. I'm not that point is possible, but you can't perpetually avoid it. This sort of reminds me of Walter Block's pushing the person out in front of the train into the river. Whether or not these lockdown policies cause things or don't cause things. Again, I think Taleb should be skeptical of his own argument. If he's so skeptical of other people's arguments and statistical models, I think he should be skeptical of his own arguments. I do agree with Taleb that there is such things as exponential growth. You can see this with factorials. The factorial of 1 is 1. The factorial of 5 is 120. The factorial of 15 is unpronounceable. I think it's in the trillions or even whatever the septrillions or whatever the number above trillions is. So yeah, there is exponential growth. There is fat tails. There is interaction effects and super spreaders. There could happen, but they didn't happen. And if they did happen, I don't think any of the policies that states would have adopted would have done anything. And as far as the point about ventilators is concerned, and this was also brought up with Slavoj Zizek and Michael Brooks, the late Michael Brooks, of course. As far as ventilator production, this goes back to a classic economic problem. Even if you had perfect socialism, okay, how many ventilators are we going to produce? Are we going to produce 8 billion ventilators, one for each person? Let's say if everyone gets the coronavirus at the exact same minute. No, that would be silly. ventilators require complex equipment. I think they cost somewhere. Let's say everyone works at $1 per hour. I would still think they cost labor theory of value time at least a day, maybe a half day. Are we going to spend a half a day to avoid a disease that, and again, and of the ventilator, of the lives saved by having a supply of ventilators ends up being a very small number, because 80% of the people on ventilators die anyway, from my understanding, once they get to a ventilator. So it's only that 20% number. So is this really worth, in a perfect socialist economy where we have perfect, I mean, if we have perfect information, is this really worth building 8 billion ventilators? No. It should be silly. It'd be a waste of time and money. I'd rather spend that, as Bastiat says, I'd rather spend that on books than ventilators. Swithin, any comments on what I've said so far?
Oh no, yeah, I entirely agree with the opportunity cost. I mean, the opportunity cost of trying to prevent the disease spreading is astonishingly high. I mean, but again, if people want to spend their own money to do it, then fine. This is what I've never got out of. Now, I did say before, it's difficult to know how things spread, and I think that's true to some extent. So you may think this is somewhat contradictory, but I've never heard anyone explain why a purely sort of private way of dealing with infectious diseases couldn't work. You could claim that on public thoroughfares, if there's no obvious owner of the land and there's sort of like a common throughway, then there might be requirements for some sort of top-down decision-making. That's possible. But when you've got clear property titles, I fail to see why you need it. I mean, one guy made the case with respect to like vaccines that, oh, well, if 20% of them don't have it, then you don't get herd immunity. Well, okay, fine. But if you've had the vaccine and it worked, then you'll be protected from it. So only people who haven't been vaccinated, will get it, assuming you don't have any natural immunity. Now you say, yeah, we've got to get the immunosuppressed people. We've got to protect them. It's like, well, protect them another way. Keep them away from those people. You know that you've been to places you haven't had it. Now, this depends on how widely available information is. But the point is, there are lots of ways you can mitigate transmission. And this is one of the problems I dislike, the problems with the mechanical models that they use. Oh, these factorials happen. It's like, well, it assumes people don't change their behavior, or they won't change their behavior, or that different people who might be vulnerable will change their behavior and people won't. They don't seem to. I mean, John Ioannidis points this out in one of his blog posts, is half these models don't really take this into account very well. And they might attempt to, some of the later ones, but they don't seem to take it in great sophistication. That might be because you can't. But nobody has explained to me how it's possible for somebody to die from coronavirus if they just keep everybody away from them. It's like, well, I get the practicalities, but like you can't transmit it. I just fail to see how it happens. So if you did want to protect people, use your own money to do it, fine, do it. But just have it where people bear the cost of their own actions and they're not going to be unilaterally imposed centrally, which is effectively what you have at present. Now, against this view is, we just want to kill old people. And this is basically what Taleb said. But he got away with it saying, it's geronticide. And he said, oh, well, if I gave you £1 billion to kill your own father, would you do it? It's like, well, no. But Taleb's taking things too much in a consequentialist view, and actually gets to the stuff I discussed with respect to sort of double effect, with respect to suicide. I mean, you can do things which have side effects, and you can do things which you intentionally do. So yeah, few people are going to go, yeah, I'll kill my own dad. But like, if there's particular actions which have a low probability of killing him and actually end up doing, are you actually responsible for that? And are you responsible for that? And would it be a bad decision for you to have done it again in retrospect? Assuming you knew what the probability distribution is, not that you definitely would die, at which point you probably wouldn't. And this gets down to the whole stupid masks thing. The whole way it's portrayed is, oh no, selfish people aren't wearing masks. It's like, well, no. if I'm ill or I'm vulnerable, I don't want everyone to change their lifestyle just to accommodate me. If I'm a guest in somebody's house, like I kind of follow their rules to some extent. I don't expect them because I'm a, an outlier. Let's suppose I'm really picky with food. I can't just go and dictate to the host that they provide everything for me in their own house. Do everything just because I'm this great exception. If you're an exception, I would take responsibility myself and avoid people that I thought could have it or whatever, and put processes into place because I don't want to mess up everybody else's existence. I want people to go out and see people and have normal human interaction. I don't want everyone to have to change their actions just because it could affect me. And so the framing of the issue, with mask, or you're selfish if you don't wear one, is part of the absurd safety culture which we discussed in the previous episode, and basically has the view that, well, if it's a classic kind of socialist view to some extent, that, oh no, or the egalitarian is probably better. So, someone's missing out. We have to do everything to help that one person, at the same time screwing everybody else over, which is effectively what we've had. One other thing before I forget. Taleb, with his approach, with his non-naive precautionary principle, I kind of like in some respects because it's not scientistic in a certain sense. It's like, well, we've had these new cases of these deaths, we're going to treat it seriously. It's a sense, in a sense, it's a sensible rule of thumb. But he misses one crucial aspect, I would say, with respect to new diseases. If the disease is causing people who would otherwise healthy, and you wouldn't normally expect to die, and a lot of them do, then you take it seriously. Now, again, I think this should be done voluntarily on the private basis, but that's something I would take seriously. With coronavirus, saw the cases. Who's dying? Old people and people who are already ill. Well, they always die. The fact that they die. The policy matter, should I be concerned about it? Whenever I hear anything, it's like, there's been an outbreak of a certain disease in a certain area. It's like, there's been deaths. It's like, I want to know who died. If it's people who would have died, like anything could have killed them, well, yeah, I don't like that happening, but like, it's not something that I'm particularly concerned about, and other people shouldn't really be concerned about. Because it doesn't really affect their behaviour, and wouldn't really affect. I mean, it might do respect to people vulnerable if they know that. Yeah, information is good. So rule of thumbs, as Taleb attempts to use, are good. I just think he needs to add something else to his weaponry to realise that actually coronavirus to begin with was never really a huge issue. As John Iadis points out, median age of death is 80, with multiple comorbidities. And it's like, well, that's not great, but these things happen. And it's not killing people who are in the prime of their life and don't have any of the illnesses. Or at least if they do, it's not in great numbers. So, yeah, Tim, any comments?
The rule of thumb point, I think, is key, because I think there's the rule of thumb that this policy is insane and is impossible to and Jeffrey Tucker points this out as well. Again, the kind of lockdown that Britain or China had never really existed in history because it was impossible to do. Only wealthy societies could ever pull off something so absurd and so humongous. It's only those societies that really could do this in the way that has been done, and to the scale it's been done. Now, again, funnily enough, whether or not it's been done to their liking is some question, but a fair amount of people did stay home for a number of weeks without going out. That is quite impressive. So as far as rules of thumb, yeah, I like the rule of thumbs. And again, I like about Taleb is he in some ways he's not scientific by the mainstream evidence-based approach to science, which is actually one of the reasons why I like Taleb. But again, I don't like Taleb's sort of, whether or not he's an a priori thinker is of some question, but his precautionary principle is very a prioristic in the sense that he's not going. It's not like you have a dice and you have 6 sides. Do you test the dice, or you just say, or do you just say, well, you use intuition, you have to run some long tests? And I agree with Taleb when it comes to this. He actually ends up sounding like an Austrian economist almost, although he rejects the Austrian approach. He's a bit of an empiricist. He's an anti-empiricist empiricist. What he really is a fat-tailed person. He just thinks that the Gaussian distribution is almost always wrong, never. I actually agree with that view. But to what this relates to the policy, to me, is of some question. I agree that the weight and height are Gaussian distribution, and the deaths of wars and the deaths of other things are not Gaussian distribution. That point, I think, is great. I agree with Taleb, but it's more of his way of thinking and his policy recommendations. He is making policy recommendations, and if he just wants mild policy recommendations, then does this even measure up to his precautionary principle? Probably not. I mean, if he basically thinks that we should just check people who are sick, they've been doing that before. If you enter Taiwan or Hong Kong, they had when I went there 2 years ago, they had a scanner to check your body temperature. Now again, you should call the civil liberties people up. Maybe that they shouldn't do that. Which again, it's huge civil liberties in violation. Many of these things are, and it's actually just one of the big negative side effects. But they've been doing that before. Whether we want to go ahead and continue doing these measures is of some question. And as far as the doctrine of double effect, I agree. I mean, I could just as easily say that if someone commits suicide because they've been locked in their house and not seeing someone, did Nassim Taleb et al. Cause that person's death? I mean, I know Taleb didn't intend to cause that death, but in the same way, if people go out, to work, or people go out to church or wherever, or go to school, they didn't intend to kill your grandmother. So I mean, I could just as easily flip this around and say that the lockdown advocates are murdering my people, because I think it's just as easy argument to make. I see no reason. And as far as one final point about Taleb, I don't. Will Taleb ever admit that he was hysterical about this? This is something that I'm to a certain extent curious about. Will he ever admit that he was wrong? I mean, a lot of these measures are quite draconian and socialistic, and they, whether or not that was their intention, is of some question. But I do find it's all the usual suspects that like these measures. So in some ways, Taleb is still a heresy in the sense that the people who advocate these policies, which is actually why I actually sort of I still like Taleb, even though he's been crazy, is, as I opened up with, is Taleb held the consistent view when it was unpopular. So that's my tell for continuing to like Taleb. But I wonder if he will ever admit that he was wrong. And as far as the reversing the argument about double effect, Swithin, do you have any comments on this? And then maybe we'll start wrapping it up.
Respect to Taleb for being consistent in certain respects. I remember loads of my doctor friends posting things on Facebook saying, "Oh, coronavirus is just another flu, nothing to be worried about." And then as soon as the official line changed, then it became the next plague. That's something with doctor types people, which doctors are obviously useful, but the way they get on in life is believe everything they've been told, because that's how they operate as a medic and as a doctor, and they're not scientists. And I'm not trying to fetishize science here, but I'm not always skeptical of what doctors say. But when things are fast moving like this and they change their tune quite quickly, it's something to raise a question mark about. So I don't think Taleb will say he was wrong. He has an ego that's just so large, it has its own gravitational field. So I severely doubt he'll admit that he is wrong. So the question now arises, will we get a second lockdown of various descriptions? I mean, they've attempted to put them in. Uh, we've now got sort of regional lockdowns now, so that's been imposed in Leicester and also in the north of England. Well, interestingly, it's basically everywhere where Muslims live, because um, the browner your skin in England, the less likely you are to abide by any of the government advice or laws with respect to coronavirus, which I actually quite like. But that's when it's all these cases are spiking. And there was a case where there was an Islamic funeral at a mosque, and there was 250 people there. It's how bad it is that you go to a funeral. Um, so it'd be interesting to see whether they are going to be able to impose one, because if they do, I don't know how many people will abide by it. I think it's very difficult to do it a second time to this extent, because as you pointed out, countries aren't rich enough to enforce these lockdowns, which is why Belarus, to a large extent, hasn't. And as a complete aside with Belarus, the Belarusian president claims that he was offered money by the IMF and the World Health Organization to impose an Italian-style lockdown, which he refused to do. Whether he's lying or whether, but that is at least noteworthy here. The media seems to be ramping up a second wave. I think they'll probably try to keep some restrictions on until probably April next year. I don't know if they'll always be abided by as stringently as they were, but for whatever reason, the powers that be are invested in restrictions, and they will jump on any possible evidence of a second wave happening, even though the second wave has got basically no chance of causing problems to health service capacity. Because one of the things that did do well in a technical sense is they increased intensive care capacity quite significantly. And that's actually why they dropped Save the NHS from their logo, because we started off by saying stay at home. What was it? Stay at home, save the NHS, save lives. That was what it said. And they dropped Save the NHS because there's no conceivable way that it's actually going to be overrun by coronavirus patients. So they might claim that could happen in the future, but they haven't said that it was anywhere near there. So second lockdown, I don't think they'll do it as severely as they did the first. I think they might try and go with some regional ones, but I think they'll certainly try and keep the restrictions for as long as they can. And actually, I think they may forever keep masks, at least in winter, because that will be a good way of stopping seasonal flu. But Tim, what's your thoughts on the second lockdown and other things?
As far as the second lockdown, who knows? And one of the things I think that needs to be stated, and I this is called, in psychology, call this motivated reasoning. Now, I think everyone to a certain extent does this. I do this myself. And I asked, what would Taleb do to say if he's wrong? I'm not sure. If there was, what would I do to say if I was wrong? Well, there'd have to be a death toll that was high. If Sweden had a death toll of 5 million, considering I'm not even sure. Sweden, I think, is 8 million. Maybe the lockdown, I would admit that the lockdown was a good idea, okay, or some mild social distancing. If Sweden came out with a death toll of 2 to 3 million, like 40% of its people. But that never happened. If anything, the opposite happened. And I think one of the things is people enjoy the coronavirus restrictions. People not only enjoy them, they love snitching on their neighbors. There's a certain witch trial aspect to it. Oh, he's not wearing a mask. He's a bad doer. It's the same with snitching on businesses that don't exactly enforce that. There was a handful of I think it's in Key West, Florida. They had a bakery. They fined it might be somewhere else. Someone could correct me if they listen. But they fined the business because people in the kitchen weren't wearing masks, and someone tipped them off. So again, people enjoy these restrictions, and this goes back to Nassim Taleb's point about doing no harm and intragenics. Nassim Taleb has a joke, I think, in one of his Q&As. I want a surgeon that hates doing surgery. The reason why is because if the surgeon is good at doing If the surgeon enjoys doing surgery, he's going to give you more surgery than is necessary and start doing harm. I think the same thing applies to here. Is if people enjoy the measures that are implemented, there's a certain zeal of post-Christian religion almost that people enjoy the religion of public health. People enjoy them. And that's why they last longer. And that's so regardless of the statistics, I think they'll end when people stop enjoying them. And actually, I think that's starting to happen in some ways. People aren't even the alarmists are going out. Even the early alarmists are starting to go out. They did not last the 18 months. They did not last the 18 months. That was probably would have been needed. That was utopian. So, intragenics, #intragenics. Do no harm. And I think the advocates, including Taleb, should think about that. Switham?
I think you're right. The lockdown policies will only continue as long as they're popular to a significant degree, because if people cease to abide by them, then they can't be enforced. There's no way. So, for example, now we've got £100 fines if you're without a mask, without a good reason in a shop. But the police have said there's no way we can enforce this. They're just trying to do it on social sanction. So, and some shops are like, well, we're not enforcing it. Like, it's not our job. People come in, we don't care. Well, not that we don't care, but that we're not actively going to accost customers. So I think that's certainly the case with these sorts of policies. And you say if I was wrong, yeah, I mean, if you have a massive death toll, then over and above what I anticipated, then yeah, maybe. But again, I would still say that those appropriate policies could have been done on a sort of voluntary private basis rather than been imposed centrally. And one of the crucial things would have been good information, which John Ioannidis has pointed out throughout, that we have had terrible information. I mean, the World Health Organization originally thought the infection fatality rate was 3.4%, which was just absurd. But we shall see. If we do a part 3, I would be highly surprised if we were wrong as to at least the death rates and things. But, we could be. We shall see. So if you have enjoyed listening to this, please share it with your friends and family and subscribe to us on YouTube or on Podbean. And if you'd like to contact the show with ideas or anything that we should cover, please contact us at mindcrimelibертyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibертyshow@gmail.com.